today is Michael Embry. He was a long time in the University of Maryland employee, retired just this past July 1. He was located here at the center for forever, it seems like, and eventually he got the title as the apiary specialist here for the Eastern Shore. And now that he has retired, there is no one in that position, at least specifically for the Eastern Shore. That was a real loss for us. Fortunately, Mike is continuing his endeavors, his interest in working with pollinators. He has his own business now called Tuckahoe Apiaries. He is also now a private consultant for the pollinating people. So he has yet to ask me to pay him to come speak at these meetings, and he is saying he's going to continue to keep bees on the farm, so we won't be hurting for our pollinators at least. But if you ask him to come out to your farm and look at your beehives or problems, you can talk to Mike about that. But I'm not sure he'll be as generous as he is with us so far as charging for his services. But he's very, very versed in all the issues concerning pollinators, and I'm sure you've all heard a lot of the talk about the issues with honeybees in particular, but certainly native pollinators as well. So without any further ado, Michael Embry.
Good morning. They wanted me to get the bad news over first. First of all, I've been having a lot of people complaining about my orange suspenders, but I want to tell you, when I'm out there working beehives in the fall with all those crazy deer hunters, these come in real handy. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about pollinators this morning. I'm going to give you some background here. Honeybees and other insects pollinate more than 100 commercial crops, 130 commercial crops in the United States with a value of $18 billion per year. And pollination by honeybees and other insect pollinators has been in decline since the late 1940s. Partly is because of sugar being supported by the federal government and honeybees not being supported by the federal government is where really the decline started. Bee colony mortality is averaged from the 1940s up until recently, it was about 10 to 15%. So we kind of use that as a baseline as what we look as an acceptable rate of loss. This is a graph that shows this decline. As you can see over time, we start in 1945 and we decline down. We get down to about 1986 and all of a sudden we have a sharp drop off. That's when we started picking up the imported mites, the varroa mite and the tracheal mite. And we had a precipitous loss at that time and we've had a decline ever since. Currently it's estimated that there are less than 2.5 million honeybee colonies in the United States. And almost half of those are ones that are owned by hobbyists with 2 beehives in their backyard, basically. So it makes a real stretch to be able to cover all the crop pollination that needs to be done with what bees we have. So, not enough bees. The decline has now started to threaten the economic viability. Like I said, I mean, they're screaming in California right now for in the almond groves for bees, and there's a very slim number of bees that are being able to be shipped out there. So we're running into problems with being able to cover all our contracts now. This is just to show you what we're talking about. We need to help save the bees now. It's really getting critical, whether they're native bees or honeybees. Now it's easy for us to count honeybees because we just count the number of hives. Native bees is more difficult to count. We don't know what's out there, and we're having to do surveys just to find out what native bees are active in which state. Delaware did this past couple of years ago, and Maryland is starting it now. And I think Pennsylvania has also done some survey work also. Since 2006, and the advent of CCD, everybody's heard about CCD, so I don't have to explain what that is. Losses in the bee colonies have averaged around 20%, up to 30%. Although in recent years the symptoms of CCD have been dropping off, we're still seeing as much bee mortality as when it was first occurring. So there's something else going on in the bee colonies. So far, commercial beekeepers have been able to keep up with what there have been beehives that are necessary for pollination, but it gets to a point where if you keep splitting your good hives to make more hives, you're putting those bees under pressure, and then you're going to have problems with even your strongest hives being effective. So the biggest issue I see when I look at all these complicated problems that beehives are having is stress. Honeybees are affected in many ways. They're affected by the beekeepers, the manipulation of the colonies for pollination, nutritional imbalances, the environment, pesticides, and pathogens. When you take and move a beehive thousands of miles over roads, bumpy roads sometimes, when we get out into the farmlands, they get even more bumpy. These bees are under a lot of stress. First of all, they're just like us. They don't want to go in their house. They want to go outside, and they can't get out for 2-3 days at a time. It's going to put a cramp on your style real quick. So that's building a stress. Then when they get into these areas, they're put out into actually areas that there's nothing for bees to feed on, for inspections, and getting certified before they move into almond groves. And then the stress is in the almond groves. There's only one thing to eat. They don't get as much of a nutritional value as they would if they were in a wide range of different plants. And the thing with the almonds is they're constantly spraying these plants while the bees are active in them. And you end up with a lot of bee carpets on the ground. So all of these stress factors have become more apparent as, I'm trying to read my own writing here, as causal agent in the decline of pollinators. And these agents are either working by themselves or by working together, or one causes the other to become more deadly, which is synergistic. You're going to have some declines in your bee colonies. But this is probably the number one pest. This is the varroa mite. This is a close-up. This is an electronic scan. And before bee mites, the average mortality was between 10 to 15%. After mites, mortality has increased to 20 to 25%, and even higher than that in some places. Varroa mite not only attack the adult bee, they also attack in the larvae stage, and that's where the mites reproduce. So they're feeding on the adult bees, they're draining it of the hemolymph, which is bee blood, causing it to die, to be not as effective as a bee should be. How's that for fun? The female bee mite will go in and hide underneath this pupa just before it's capped, and it'll lay 4 to 6 eggs usually, and they all emerge at the same time, and then they go through grab a hold of another bee and go through the whole process again. This fall, I saw more mite populations in beehives than I've seen in the last several years. A lot of people treated in July and August, and they didn't go back and check their bees going into winter. And in October and November, I was finding heavy mite loads into bees. A lot of bee death was going on. I saw both deformed wing virus and K virus on bees this fall. And I was getting all these calls from beekeepers. My bees have collapsed. My bees have collapsed. And this was because of these issues. Or they got so much pressure that bees decided, we can't make it in this hive, and they all leave. They would just go. This is what one of the diseases looks like. This is deformed wing virus. And as you can see, this bee basically is non-functional. It can't fly anymore. It can't do the job it's supposed to do. It's very small in size. You'll see them crawling around inside the hive. And then they eventually die. So, they're expending energy to produce bees that are not going to be able to survive. And it depletes the colony that way. This is another pest that we have. It's especially prevalent here on the Eastern Shore. I don't know, it's Western Maryland, I know gets some of it in some areas. It's the small hive beetle. I've been doing a lot of work with this guy. These guys do not feed directly on the honeybee, but they eat the food resources that the bees have in the hive. So not only are honeybees having to support themselves, they're having to support these beetles. They contaminate the hive food resources so bees will not eat. They actually produce, the larvae produce a slime on their bodies which causes the honey or the pollen to go foul, and then because of that the bees won't eat it. And they'll actually retreat away from it, and they retreat back until the point where either they die or they abscond, which means they go away, they fly off. So this has been a very serious pest. It also will infest bumblebee colonies, wild bee bumblebee colonies, or ones that we're using for pollination that come in those boxes. And this is one of the worst things about it is I've seen a lot of growers leave those bumblebee boxes out there until late in the fall, and then they clean them up. And by doing that, you're allowing these small hive beetles to reproduce and expand, and then they come back and reinfest whatever beehives are there at the same time. The other problem that I have with using these bumblebee boxes is they have a specific bumblebee in it. It's Bombus impatiens. Bombus impatiens also exist here. And we have 3 other bumblebees that exist here at the same time. So we have 4 native bumblebees. But we keep pumping more and more Bombus impatiens into the environment. What is it doing to those other 3 bumblebee species that we do have? It's crowding them out, isn't it? It's decreasing their populations because we're making it more successful for Bombus impatiens. Another problem we have a serious problem here on the Eastern Shore. It's with winter bee losses. When we have 80 degrees in January and 20 degrees in February, there's a problem going on. Bees will eat food in the colony, and if in normal winter they should be in a tight cluster, just tight like a ball. But when it gets warm, that cluster expands out, and they consume food, and they consume food, and they consume food. But then we get this cold snaps coming in here in February, and all of a sudden that brood collapses down into that tight ball again, but there's no food around. And they won't go where the food is. They sit there and they starve to death, or they freeze to death, depending on their population. So we're having this, it's very important for beekeepers now to go out in February and try to put some type of sugar resources on the top of the hive, so that the bees follow the heat up to where the food is and they'll eat off of that, rather than try to go out to where the frames are on the outside to work on those frames. So this has been a real critical issue. This past year, for the first time, I actually set up a citizen science project with some of my other beekeepers to try to insulate our hives. We've never had to wrap beehives here on the Eastern Shore before, but this year I wanted to see whether or not we have better survivorship. So I had 4 or 5 different types of materials that we were using to insulate with. We were using black tar paper, we were using blankets, we were using foam insulation, air pocket insulation you can get for housing, and actually foam insulation, and trying to see if there was any better survivorship with that. And I haven't been back to look after this last big cold snap, so I don't know what to say yet. And I don't know what everybody else is going to report here in the spring. So this is something that's ongoing. But as you can see, this is a survey that was done in Virginia. It's continued since then, but I got this graph from it. But you can see we're having winter losses up to 30%. And you think about 30% winter losses and 20% mite losses or stress losses, and then the average 10% loss. That's where we're getting up to 60% bee mortality. And I haven't even finished.
More good news.
Oh yeah, I got more good news. How about this? Nutrition. This is a desert to honeybees. Regardless of what the crop is, if it's just one crop and that's all they get to eat, it's like you getting a bowl of rice every day. And that's all you get to eat. You're going to start having some nutritional factors going crazy on you. Not that I'm picking on rice. But it's just that this is a desert. It doesn't really provide enough resource materials for bees, and they become stressed by it. And when you get stressed, you end up being exposed to what? Disease. And so that's keys all in. Bees need pollen as well as the honey. You say, well, it's a great honey crop, but there may not be any pollen in there for bees. And then you have the situation where there are great sources of pollen, but maybe they're not nutritionally efficient. I mean, corn pollen only has 30% protein. I mean, corn pollen has 10% protein, whereas soybean pollen has 30% protein. So which would be better for the bees? The higher the protein, the better the bee. Okay? So there's some issues about that. And this, land fragmentation. We all know what constant housing development's going on, and we're breaking up the land more. And as the Scott's Fertilizer says, what you want is a good green turf in your yard. Well, bees don't want a good green turf. They want to have those weeds in your yard. You know, give them a more nutritional value that way. So this has been a real problem for not only the honeybees, but for native bees, because we're destroying a lot of sites that native bees would be present in. You know, whether it's for nesting or for foraging. Native bees need as much as good continuous land as the honeybees do. Then we get to the insecticides. You know, highly toxic insecticides with residual toxicity larger than 8 hours are responsible for most of the acute bee poisoning that goes on. Chronic issues in honeybees can develop from long-term exposure to pesticides in colonies. And this is basically the ones that are out there that are bad guys we're looking at. And you know, even though neonicotinoids look like they're not going to be available to us much longer, yeah, we're losing enough bees from pyrethroids to make up for that. So this is an issue that we still are working with. The EPA has now started looking more at the chronic, when we used to okay an insecticide through EPA for use in agriculture or for homeowners, it was done on acute toxicity. But now EPA has started all the testing labs to start looking at chronic exposures, you know, longer term periods. And we're actually now testing larvae all the way through to adult to see whether or not there's any indication of pesticide poisoning in them. But there's still more work to be done, and now we want to do large field studies in that regard. So finally, we may be on the right track. Plus, EPA has now started looking at other native bees. They're looking at bumblebees particularly, I guess because they're getting to be used more commercially, but we're also looking at mason bees and some of the other smaller bees. Now, you got to realize that if you have a pesticide that is good enough that it's legal for honeybees to use, that is a certain amount of pesticide. Now, when you have a bee that's half the size of a honeybee, such as a squash bee, is that same amount going to be more lethal to that sweat bee or that squash bee than it was to that honeybee? So we're going to have to come up with some kind of a medium on what is the right dosage. You know, if you want to protect the environment, you'll be very concerned about this. But I'm not going to, you know, you guys, you get trained, you know, we have programs for pesticides all the time. So, and you read, hopefully you all read the labels, but, you know, I assume you do. You know, you probably are one of the least factors in what's going on with bee colonies. But, you know, you get the brunt of the problem. You know, everybody wants to point a finger at somebody. So what can growers do? Well, you know, check your spray schedule and establish some spray buffers. You know, areas around the fields that are not being sprayed so the bees have somewhere else to forage on. Talk to your beekeeper about your pesticide, what pesticides are used before and during. It's important that a beekeeper, when he brings his bees in, know what's been on that plant before he comes there, because there could be some long-term chemical reactions that the bee would be exposed to that you really don't want him to be exposed to. So you want to be able to talk to your beekeeper. I always say, talk to your beekeeper. You guys need to have a relationship. And so, you know, you want to control blooming weeds, especially in orchard crops. You don't want bees being attracted to the dandelions on the ground when your apple trees are in bloom or peach trees are in bloom. You want to learn the pollination requirements. And then again, your beekeeper can tell you what your requirements are. I always say, I had a farmer that was growing cantaloupes down in Lower Caroline County, and he wanted me to bring bees in when the very first blooms come on. And I kept saying, no, I can't, don't want to do that. I want to wait at least until you have 10 days of bloom before I move in. No, 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 I want to make that big first fruit. I wanted that king fruit, he called it. And I said, no, we can't move them in. And he insisted on it. So I finally broke down and I took the bees down there and the bees set them up. And sure enough, the bees would come out over the cantaloupe fields and they'd make a right turn and go into the woods where the black locust was blooming. If you had waited until that black locust bloom had been over, the bees would have stayed in the cantaloupes. I had another farmer that had a situation where he was growing his watermelons right next to his cantaloupes. And he was complaining to me. He says, I see bees all the time in the cantaloupes and I don't see much in the watermelons. And I said, well, that's because the cantaloupe flowers are up above the foliage and it's easier for the bees to access. And the watermelons are down underneath the foliage and they don't want to go back in there and look for things. Bumblebees and Melisode bees, digger bees, they don't mind going under the brush to find something to feed on. But honeybees, they're, you know, in some ways maybe I should say they're lazy, and they like those top blossoms to work. So what would you do in that situation? You need to separate where the watermelon field is from the cantaloupe field. So they're blooming at the same time, but if you put your bees on, let's say this is your cantaloupe field and this is your watermelon field, you want to put your bees on this side of the fields so that they work out across the watermelons first before they get to the cantaloupes. And, you know, so whenever possible, follow IPM. Avoid putting on materials before they're needed, so you know, avoid your prophylactic treatments, and use recommended rates. There's mounting evidence that other materials used by growers such as fungicides, herbicides, acaricides, IGRs, spreaders, stickers are also causing issues with bees, longevity, reduced immune functions, and mortality. Spreader stickers are especially a problem. I've seen it in apple orchards where bees are basically glued onto the blossoms because of the spreader sticker that's used correctly with streptomycin to protect the blooms, and it's actually it's causing these native bee populations to crash because they're getting glued onto flowers and can't get back to do the jobs they should. So this is one of those issues that could be a problem. This is what we'd like to see sometimes, is a happy bee. Buried in the pollen. This is actually a native bee. This is Halictus lingaria. So let's talk a little bit about native bees. They're good to supplement honeybees for pollination of certain crops, but I don't think that native bees by themselves can do the commercial pollination that we require. Bumblebees can do it in greenhouses because honeybees run to the window and they yell, help me, help me, help me, because they want to go out. They don't want to stay in the greenhouses. So we've never been able to get honeybee colonies established in greenhouses. We haven't done any work down here on tunnels. Are we ever going to do any work?
We're not or other than bumblebees.
Yeah, so it's been one of those issues. They have not been extensively studied until now, I guess because of the big push, because of the problem with honeybees. Now they want to study native bees and try it. Everybody's looking for an easy fix. Well, there is no easy fix. You know, you can't really supplement or substitute native bees for honeybees. We need both. We actually need both. When I did a sample run on trapping in watermelon fields here, I found as many or more bumblebees and digger bees in watermelon fields than I did honeybees. So they are really supplementing, but they're not being the only one there. And when you think about it, native bees are more efficient, but it takes longer for them to develop enough population to be effective. They need wild areas, not only for foraging, but for nesting sites. So, you know, we used to have these hedgerows between fields. Well, pretty much the hedgerows have disappeared. So there's no nesting sites left. Some of these things were actually good for nesting sites that are still available, and we curse them as weeds, we take them down all the time, but Phragmite tubes work great for mason bees. Phragmite grasses, that we see around here. So there are materials that are out there that they could be used. It's easy to set up a mason bee colony. If you have a 5-gallon bucket and some Phragmite straws, you could have a mason bee colony. They are here, they're in our area. It's the old adage, if you build it, they will come. So you can develop your own mason bee colonies, and they're easy to handle. They're stingless. You can have the kids raise them and not have a problem with them coming in saying, "I'm stunned, I'm stunned, I'm stunned." So this is another a good bee to do it. But again, it's something that can substitute at a certain time of the year, but it's not going to be around all year. So in April, May, and June, you have mason bees. After June, they're gone for the year. And then the next year they come back again, April, May, and June. But the problem with most of these is that we'll never be able to say, I can take a box of solitary bees or native bees and move it from point A to point B. It doesn't work that way because most of these populations live in the soil. They do not live in tubes like mason bees or in hives like bumblebees or honeybees. So it's very hard for moving them. And this is what you'd look for, or he would be looking. It's like the gopher coming out of the hole, seeing whether he has a shadow or not. But you would see these sites, they like drained land with bare vegetation, and what you end up with is a site like this where you see mounds and mounds of these nesting sites going on. I had a guy down in Dorchester County near Rhodesdale, was a watermelon grower, that had a huge population of solitary bees in one of his fields. But every year he plowed them up. And I kept saying, you should plow around these guys because these guys are doing a good pollination service for you. But he wanted to have that irrigation ring complete, so he kept cutting them up. But they kept responding, so hopefully he's managed to do something about that. Native bees are highly efficient pollinators, and unlike honeybees that have union rules about flying when it's raining or flying when it's cold, they're more active at those times, so that they will fly when windy conditions or rainy conditions or cold conditions. They also are very active. They will visit more flowers in a minute than a honeybee will. And if you talk about number of visits to make let's say a watermelon, it takes 12 visits by a honeybee to make a watermelon. It only takes 5 to 7 visits from a bumblebee or a Melisodes bee to make a watermelon. So they're very more efficient at doing it. And one of the reasons that they will do that is they have a technique of pollinating called buzz pollination, where they actually, when they land on a flower, they vibrate their body, which shatters the pollen off of the stigma. So much more of it gets around the flower and causes fertilization to occur. And then it also gets more on their bodies. And when they go to the next flower, you get better cross-fertilization because you have more pollen cells to go from one to the other. So that's one of the positive things about it. But like I said before, they're much smaller populations. They're slow to develop because in most cases it's only the queens, the reproductive queens, that survive the winter, and then they emerge in the spring and they do all the work until the first workers are supplied, and then they expand from there. And that's why with bumblebees you only see colonies between 300 to 500 bees. So they're just slower. They don't build up the population. So if you had a bumblebee nest with 300 bees in it in peak summertime, and you have a honeybee colony with 50,000 bees in it at summertime, which would be the more efficient pollinator? So that's why I say they will never be the main pollinator. They will always be the supplemental pollinator. So what can you as a grower do to protect native bees? First of all, the most important thing is to provide nesting sites and provide pollen and nectar resources away from the treated crops. A lot of people now are getting into putting in bee pastures, or they're using some of their prep lands for putting in pollinators. It's now been allowed, I think up to 30% of prep land to be put into wildflowers rather than just warm season grasses. Do not apply pesticides or allow drift to move into the adjacent wild areas. Also, don't drive across it. You know, don't say your tractor trail is where the wild area is. You know, you got to go beyond that. You know, you need to scout your crops areas for ground nests and solitary bees, such as squash bees. You got to go out there and look. You just can't assume what you have or what you don't have. And learn, again, you know, you can learn from beekeepers on some of these issues, you know, or you can pay my price and I'll come and consult you about it. Yeah. But this is what we're looking at for the end. We don't want to do the pollination ourselves. We don't want to go out there with cigarette filters in China and hit each apple blossom, or with electric toothbrushes to vibrate the tomato plant flowers to get them to produce fruit. So that's all I got to say.
Yeah, we got a couple minutes for questions. So
Yeah, go
Could you
ahead.
expand a little bit on that mason bee, setting those up? You said you could just use the Phragmites and a
Well, you can use Phragmites, you can use bramble stems, you can use grape stems, anything that has a hollow pith in it, you can use it. And what you want to look for is something about 1/4 to 1/8 in size, hollow tube. Bamboo works great because you can segment the bamboo. And you set them up in bundles. And I got handouts by the ton for you if you want to. We could go with that. You know.
You just ring the field with them?
Yeah, I put them. Don't put them in plastic tubes because the plastic will sweat and it'll actually kill the larvae in the tube. So you want to put them in. I use coffee cans, or I make wooden nesting blocks and put them around the fields, or put them on the south side of your barn and just let them nest there, and they'll work their way out from there. One of the keys with mason bees is give them a water source. They like wet ground to drink water from, so you need to have that. And the other key with them is don't step on them in spring when they're doing their mating, because they're doing it on the ground. But if you want to get with me after, I'll get you some of the material. Yeah.
The varroa mites, do they attack the wild bees, all of them or some of them?
We're seeing more of it being prevalent in some in bumblebee boxes, but not the wild bees in general. Because I think it's partly because of the nesting differences between honeybees and the other types of bees that is causing not causing this transfer over. Hopefully we don't have it. We're now worried about a third mite being imported into this country, Tropolepsis, and they are scouting and scouting and scouting to make sure that that is not happening. But it's a big, as European bees are moving into Southeast Asia, they're into that area where Tropolepsis is prevalent on Asian honeybees. So they're looking for that jump over. And it's already occurring in Southeast Asia. Yes, all the way back.
So what does some of these ground nests look like? What are we looking for when we go out there?
Well,
too late.
too late. You want to look, first of all, you look for areas that are well drained in your fields. Well drained areas around your fields that have sparse vegetation on them. And then what you want to do is they look like little ant hills. Well, they're bigger than an ant hill, but I'm just trying to give you an analogy. And you look for those, and that's where these nesting sites are. And then just flag it off and say, okay, no driving over, no mowing over, whatever, so that they can develop in those areas. That's key, basically. But like I said, a lot of growers or farmers don't like to get off their tractors, so they don't see these things. So it's a time when you need to do a walk around. Okay, Sue.
You said it was time to start feeding them now?
Yeah.
At this time of year, when you get in there, I lifted the lid the other day just to look, and they went berserk on me. They were so angry. Do you smoke them in the winter too when you put
No,
them?
I don't. And it may have been they were more active than normal, but you should have been able to put candy board in there I was putting, just before the blizzard, I had 2 pounds of candy in some of my hives, so, because they were that active. Okay, but that's just your bees. I know your bees, so.
So what kind of keep them?
Candy boards. Put some candy mixture in there. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
I'm just curious. In the fall, we had sugar water in the hummingbird feeder, and we had a lot of bees.
Well,
We put a
it's the
plate
same
of
thing.
sugar water, and they went crazy.
Uh-huh.
Then I heard you shouldn't do that.
No, it's not a problem, as long as there's gravel in the sugar water, so the bees have something to stand on, because if it gets too deep, they drown. You know, so, you know,
So
it's
it
like
won't hurt 'em.
warning deep swimming pool, put, stay on rocks or something. But, no, we say the same thing about giving them water any time of the year. You can put it in a bird bath for the bees to drink, but you gotta put gravel in the bird bath too. Sugar water can be a problem if it's used inside the hive. We have top feeders that go inside the hive, or frame feeders that go inside the hive, because small hive beetle larvae will use those for swimming pools, and once they start using it, the bees won't drink the syrup. So that's why we switch over to hard candy at this time of year. Plus, they get belly aches if it's cold and they're drinking liquid syrup. So you don't want that to happen. Yeah.
When you talked about putting Phragmites in a bucket
Mm-hmm.
so they can make nests, should the Phragmite leaves stand straight up?
No, I put the bucket sideways because you don't want it to fill up with water.
That's right.
Yeah, and you, actually, if you're going to do that, I would suggest you drill a hole in at the bottom angle so water can drain out. There could be in there. So you don't want water to damage your
And fill the
nesting
bucket with
straws.
sand.
Huh?
Fill the bucket with sand also.
Sand gets wet and then you end up damaging the hives with the moisture. Problem is we want to keep the straws dry. So you want the water to drain out as fast as possible. Okay. I'll get you your papers.
All right, thanks, Mike. Yeah, we give Mike a hand for presentation today.